I'm going to open with a chant. Om Vanme Manasi Pratishtita Mano Me Vachi Pratishtitam Aviraviramaedi Te Tashyama Anishtaha Shrutam Me Ma Prahasi Anena Dite Nahoratransan Yadhami Ritam Varishyami Satyam Varishyami Tadmamavatu Tadbhaktaramavatu Avatu Mam Avatu Bhaktaram Om Shanti 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 Om. May my speech be one with my mind, and may my mind be one with my speech. O thou self-luminous Brahman, remove thy veil of ignorance before me, that I may behold thy light. Do thou reveal to me the spirit of the scriptures. May the truth of the scriptures be ever present to me. May I seek day and night to realize what I learned from the sages. May I speak the truth of Brahman. May I speak the truth. May it protect me. May it protect my teacher. Om peace, peace, peace be unto us all. Today's topic is the yoga of renunciation. And we are at the 18th chapter, the last chapter of the Gita. The Gita opens with Arjuna asking the question, I want to learn the truth about renunciation and attachment. What is the difference between these two principles? That's a very good question. In verse 2, Sri Krishna begins, the sages tell us that renunciation means the complete giving up of all actions which are motivated by desire. And they say that non-attachment means abandonment of the fruits of action. Now, renunciation is a scary word for many spiritual aspirants. They say, I want a little bit of religion, but I don't want to make it my life. Swami Sheshananda, disciple of Holy Mother, used the word renunciation fearlessly in his lectures, to the point where members in his center's audience referred to it as the R word. But it's really not such a scary term if we unpack its deep and rich meaning. It doesn't mean giving up all we have. Rather, it means getting more. So this chapter summarizes the Gita's main teaching. You'll remember when Sri Ramakrishna was asked the significance of the Gita in the gospel. He said, it is what you find by repeating the word 10 times. It is then reversed into Tagi, which means a person who has renounced everything for God. And the lesson of the Gita is, O man, renounce everything and seek God alone. The master added, whether a man is a monk or a householder, he has to shake off all attachment from his mind. That's the secret, and that's the trick. Krishna has previously referred to renunciation and non-attachment in the Gita. And those of you who have Gitas, I encourage you to bring them to these Sunday sessions. It's very helpful for you to follow along with your own copy. In Gita 5:13, chapter 5, verse 13, Krishna mentions the meaning of sannyasa. Happy is that dweller in the city of 9 gates, he says, whose discrimination has cut him free from his act. He is not involved in action. He does not involve others. In other words, the real karma yogi is an instrument, completely rid of egoism and sense of agency. Krishna also mentions tyaga in the Gita in chapter 4, verse 20. He says, turning his face from the fruit, he needs nothing. The Atman is enough. He acts and is beyond action. Now here, such a karma yogi is completely unattached, like a mail carrier delivering mail that contains both happy and unhappy news. It's that quality. In the second chapter of the Gita, verse 11, Krishna reveals yet another dimension of non-attachment. He says, if you can't be absorbed in me, concentrate on me, or work to please me, if you cannot even do this, then surrender yourself to me completely. Control the lusts of the heart and renounce the fruits of every action. In other words, genuine karma yogi surrenders the fruit of the action and remains indifferent to it. And we'll go into this deeper in this talk. Krishna refers to two Sanskrit words. Sannyasa refers to the kind of renunciation where one gives up progeny, wealth, and livelihood to devote one's life exclusively to the Supreme Self. And tyaga means non-attachment. Sri Ramakrishna describes this lifestyle. He used to say, and beautiful examples that stay with us, live in the world like a waterfowl. The water clings to the bird, but the bird shakes it off. Or live in the world like a mudfish. The fish lives in the mud, but its skin is always bright and shining. Swami Pravrajika, whose commentary I'm going to be drawing on quite a bit, explains the renunciation that Sri Ramakrishna taught is not escape from the world, but seeing God in every being, in everything, changing our perspective from I and mine to thee and thine, and performing all actions as service to the living God who dwells in all beings. So this meaning of renunciation is not scary or intimidating at all. It's something we can all strive for. It's a freedom we desire. Prabhupada Swami further describes Sri Krishna's teaching of renunciation and non-attachment as a twofold process. He says we must first give up work motivated by self-centered desires. That's renunciation. And then surrender the results or fruits of our work to God in a spirit of work as worship. That is non-attachment. Now we come to verses 3 through 6. Sri Krishna speaks to us. Some philosophers declare that all kinds of action should be given up because action always contains a certain measure of evil. Others say that acts of sacrifice, almsgiving, and austerity should not be given up. Now you shall hear the truth of this matter. He goes on. Acts of sacrifice, almsgiving, and austerity should not be given up. Their performance is necessary. For sacrifice, almsgiving, and austerity, Krishna tells us, are a means of purification to those who rightly understand them. In verse 6, he says, but even these acts must be performed without attachment or regard for their fruits. Such is my final and considered judgment. So here it's important to share that in ancient India, karma meant action, which referred to rites and ceremonies performed for a motive for public welfare works. The Advaita philosopher Shankara posited that karma yoga and jnana yoga were incompatible. Swami Nikhilananda explained, action denotes a consciousness of diversity, such as a distinction between the agent, the instrument of action, and the result. But a man endowed with knowledge sees only unity. So you see, Sri Krishna and Swami Vivekananda would disagree with Shankara, as we shall see, because the idea of karma has changed. To them, karma yoga is not as Shankara presents it, merely a preliminary discipline of selfless work that purifies the heart to make the aspirant ready for knowledge of Brahman. For them, it can lead directly to union with Brahman. In fact, karma yoga, we use the term very loosely, but it is perhaps the most difficult of all yogas. When Sri Krishna says some philosophers declare that all kinds of action should be given up, Swami Vivekananda would agree with those philosophers. In his lecture, Non-Attachment is Complete Self-Abnegation, he boldly stated, there is no action which does not bear good and evil fruits at the same time. To take the nearest example, he went on, I am talking to you, and some of you perhaps think I am doing good. And at the same time, I am perhaps killing thousands of microbes in the atmosphere. I am thus doing evil to something else. He concludes, but what follows from it? That howsoever we may try, there cannot be any action which is perfectly pure or any which is perfectly impure. However, Vivekananda would also agree with Sri Krishna that nobody can truly give up action. Krishna states in the Gita, 3rd chapter, verses 4 and 5, freedom from activity is never achieved by abstaining from action. Nobody can become perfect by merely ceasing to act. In fact, nobody can ever rest from his activity, even for a moment. All are helplessly forced to act by the gunas. In other words, just to live, we must breathe, eat, sleep, think. In other words, act. When Sri Krishna says acts of sacrifice, almsgiving, and austerity should not be given up, but must be performed without attachment or regard for their fruits, he means by performing righteous actions without any sense of attachment to their fruits, we begin to purify our mind and free ourselves from ignorance. It's a conscious yoga. In this connection, Swami Pravrajika explains the view of Sri Krishna and Vivekananda. This is the secret of work, when every action becomes an act of sacrifice, a sacrament. Past karmas are purified and mitigated. This is how any spiritual aspirant who engages in selfless service can practice renunciation and non-attachment while living in the world and thus advance spiritually. Now we come to verses 7 through 9. Sri Krishna speaks to us. He says, renunciation is said to be of 3 kinds. If a man in his ignorance renounces those actions which the scriptures ordain, his renunciation is inspired by tamas. If he abstains from any action merely because it is disagreeable, or because he fears it will cause him bodily harm, his renunciation is inspired by rajas. He will not obtain any spiritual benefit from such renunciation. But when a man performs an action which is sanctioned by the scriptures and does it for duty's sake only, renouncing all attachment, and desire for its fruits, then his renunciation is inspired by sattva. Now comes the commentary. Renunciation is various according to the play of the three gunas. It can be tamasic, rajasic, or sattvic. And it's very helpful to see our actions and our thoughts in that category. It gives us a little distance on where we are and where we need to be. At the beginning of the Gita, when Arjuna, a mighty warrior, enters the battlefield and surveys his enemies, he's suddenly overcome by rajasic renunciation. Rather than uphold dharma and fight a righteous war, he's overcome by grief at the thought of slaying his kin, no matter how wicked or deluded they were. Only the renunciation of the ego is real renunciation. And that's an internal thing that only you can see, only you and I can see, because it brings lasting benefits. It's not played out on our shirt sleeve. We're not boasting to others how we're working. We work silently, quietly. Once upon a time, a teacher told his disciple to renounce. So the disciple renounced his wife, his home, his possessions. And after 1 year, he returned to his teacher. But the teacher said, renounce. So for another year, the disciple went off, practiced severe austerities, lived off alms, and slept under the sky. And then when he returned, his teacher said to him, I told you to renounce. The disciple thought, what do I have left? My body. So he decided to end his life and enter into the fire. Just then, his teacher appeared. No, I told you to renounce. Don't you see? This body is not yours to renounce. It was given by your parents. Renounce your ego. So from another perspective, according to some Gita commentators, there are 3 stages of renunciation. Work is a means to realization. First, we must strive to renounce the fruits of our actions mentally. Second, we must try to renounce the sense that I am the doer of the action. And that is much more difficult because that takes place while we are working. And that is why karma yoga is so difficult. Third, we must strive to know that the personal God, Ishvara, alone is the author of all action. Now, why is that? Because we cannot think, we cannot breathe, we cannot do without that consciousness of the Atman within, the unseen seer. When that consciousness leaves, the body dies. And it is that consciousness that allows us to work, allows us to think, allows us to breathe, but we think, I am doing, I am breathing, I am living, I am doing such, and so on. So renunciation doesn't mean giving up action. It means giving up the fruits of our action. How? Let's try to make it simple. By performing all work as worship. You see? Swami Brahmananda explained, know that all work is the Lord's work. Now we have a Karma Yoga Day here, usually once a month. And it's easy for us to think that our Karma Yoga is the Lord's work because we're working on the Lord's grounds. We must feel that in whatever we do, wherever we are. Brahmananda goes on, Learn to forget yourself while working. Know you are worshiping the Lord through your work. See? Now our karma yogis will be coming and working in the garden. Brahmananda would say, look, this garden is a cosmic worship of Brahman. Wherever the Swami went, in whatever ashram he was established, he always had a garden. And we as worshipers, in Santa Barbara, we had 2 worships every day that we had to perform. We had over 300 rose bushes, huge garden to pick from. But our Swami Prabhupada said, never deplete the garden, because there is a cosmic worship going on. And those who have the eyes to see can see that. Now then, we ask, how do we renounce the ego idea that I am the doer? We strive to attain the attitude, I am only the instrument. How do we do this? By reminding ourselves, I'm only the instrument. I've been given this job to do. I am the instrument. The Lord is the doer. So we must strive to erase the idea from our mind. Also that I am indispensable, because that attitude relegates our work to karma and to the law of karma. No one is indispensable. If this is the Lord's work, especially here at the Vedanta Center, no matter who comes or goes, the Lord's work will continue. Swami Shivananda said, the Lord does his own work. You and I are simply his instruments. Keep your gaze fixed at his feet, and whatever is necessary, he will have done by you, if he so chooses. So when we reach the 3rd stage, that Ishvara, knowing that Ishvara is the author of all action, we know beyond doubt that the Lord's will is operating throughout the universe, and we become free from the law of karma. That is the real meaning of renunciation. And with that is the genuine spiritual experience that accompanies it. So we don't just renounce and we're left bereft of everything. We are filled. We are filled with the knowledge of Brahman. Swami Sardhananda explained the mechanics of how this stage is reached. Through selfless work, the mind gets purified. And when the mind becomes pure, there arise knowledge and devotion in it. Knowledge is the very nature of the self, but being covered with ignorance, it is not manifest. The object of selfless work is to remove this covering of ignorance. Verses 10 and 11. Sri Krishna says, when a man is endowed with, and remember, he's speaking to Arjuna, when a man is endowed with spiritual discrimination and illumined by knowledge of the Atman, all his doubts are dispelled. He does not shrink from doing what is disagreeable to him, nor does he long to do what is agreeable. No human being can give up action altogether, but he who gives up the fruits of action is said to be non-attached. Now the commentary. Sri Krishna says again, when a man is endowed with spiritual discrimination and illumined, he does not shrink from doing what is disagreeable to him. We had a beautiful example of that in a devotee in Santa Barbara. His name was Stephen Berg. And as he was initiated as a young man by Swami Vivedishananda, disciple of Swami Brahmananda. And the head of the Fiji ashram noticed Stephen and invited him to come to Fiji and be a high school teacher in the ashram's high school there, which Stephen did for 8 years. And then being a surfer, a very good surfer, he looked at a map of the different centers in the United States and discovered Santa Barbara, which had very good surf. And actually, it's a beautiful, it's on 50 acres. It's up in the National Forest, and it's about 10 minutes from the ocean. So he chose Santa Barbara. And when Stephen came, he said, I don't want to be a burden to anyone. I'm here to work. And whatever work you give me, I will do. That is all. And Stephen, who had a degree in forestry and also education, chose to be a mail carrier. Now, he lived in a little room below our pavilion, which was built by a devotee from the East Coast. And the room was really crude, but he made it his home. But he wanted to work in order to gain enough money to live by. And so he chose to be a mail carrier. Why? Because he could memorize the Gita on his mail route. And no matter what chore we had, and remember, we're on 50 acres, many buildings, a temple, a shrine, and many, many houses, he did it every Sunday morning. He would check the rat traps. And because we lived in the country, we had mice and rats and rattlesnakes. And Stephen was always there to do the unpleasant, never flinching. He came to be a nobody. And Swami Premananda said, when he was told, oh, you must be somebody, you were a disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, he said, we were nobodies. Stephen Berg was a nobody. He came, he served, and when he passed away, there were so many people that he had helped on his mail route that we learned about. And when the forest fires broke out in the forest behind our temple, Stephen worked right alongside the firefighters. They loved him. This was a man of selfless service. He was an example to all. Swami Chidbhavananda goes deeply into the why. An illumined soul has a clear mind and sees everything as it is, because a mind purified by knowledge of the Purusha is a clear mirror. It acquires no merit by reflecting beautiful objects, nor demerit by reflecting ugly and dirty objects. The activities of Prakriti, the Swami explained, are reflected in the Purusha. On that ground, the Purusha is not affected in any way. So we can all rise to that even-mindedness of Astita Pragya, one established in perfect knowledge, by training the mind to perform all actions, whether agreeable or disagreeable. Then our actions are not motivated by selfish desires. In fact, we become an instrument, a real instrument of the Lord, which means we know that it is He who makes us act. We've washed ourselves clean of all ego. Verses 12 through 14, Sri Krishna speaks to us. To those who have not yet renounced the ego and its desires, action bears three kinds of fruit: pleasant, unpleasant, and a mixture of both. They will be reaped in due season, but those who have renounced ego and desire will reap no fruit at all, either in this world or in the next. All our action, Krishna says, has 5 partakers. So say the scriptures. That teach us wisdom to break the bondage earned by our action. Listen and learn them. First, this body. Then the ego, the doer, the organs of sense, and the many motions of life in the body. Lastly, the devas, in spirit presiding. So Vedanta tells us that the purpose of all karma, all action, is to transcend it. But as long as we remain in ignorance, the law of karma operates for us and within us. As we sow, so do we reap. How does this take place within us? We are all attached to our psychophysical framework through a body that manifests attachment and aversion. There are 5 pranas within this body, and they sustain our psychophysical apparatus through breath, circulation, metabolism, digestion, elimination. Then each of our 5 sense organs are controlled by a reflection of consciousness, which Hinduism refers to as their presiding deity. For example, Aditya, the sun god, is the presiding deity of our eyes, by whose aid it sees and responds. But it's important to remember that the presiding deity is not the Atman. It's only reflected consciousness. Hence, due to our ignorance, we become identified with our body, mind, being, and its apparatus. Prabhupada Swami explains, here, the word ignorance means the sense of ego, that I am the doer. The moment we think, I am separate, I am an individual, we set up a chain reaction. The claim to individuality for ourselves implies individuality everywhere. Lose the ego idea in transcendental consciousness, and the world appearance must necessarily vanish, and along with it, the law of karma. Until then, we remain subject to the karmas we create, to their fruits, pleasant, unpleasant, or a combination of both. And thus, we experience happiness and misery. But when we strive to work selflessly, worshipfully, and without attachment to results, we purify the mind. Slowly over time, the mind becomes purified. With a pure mind and heart, we directly experience the will of God. As Vivekananda expressed, without whose command a leaf does not fall, a heart does not beat, who is nearer to me than my own self. This is a matter of experience. The will of the Lord, when one sees that, feels that, experiences that. Where then is the law of karma when we, as Vivekananda described, are not? The world is not. He is. Only He, meaning God, is. Now we come to verses 15 and 16. Whatever the action, excellent, evil, whether of speech, of mind, or of body, these are its causers. Falsely he sees, and with small discernment, who sees this Atman, the doer of action, his mind is not purged in the work of the Spirit. Now, because we misidentify ourself with our bodies, sense organs, mind, and ego, we think our real I is involved in our actions. And thus we suffer from the effects of our actions and are bound to the law of karma, one of the Gita's most essential truths to realize. Suppose we think a thought. Is the Atman in the mind? No. The self is separate from the mind. But we go ahead and identify with the thought, good or bad, and become elated or depressed according to the nature of the thought. Our teachers explain instead We must learn to be the witness. Be the witness of our thoughts. That is the point Sri Krishna is making in this verse. Tie ourselves to the unseen seer. First, by tying ourselves to the buddhi, the higher mind, that can watch the mind, and know that that buddhi is in the heart. It is pointing to the Atman, the unseen seer. We must learn that we have a mind, but we are not the mind. Thoughts are impermanent, they come and they go, but the witness remains. We must learn to be mindful of our actions as a witness and act righteously and objectively. Verse 17, Sri Krishna says, but he whose mind dwells beyond attachment, untainted by ego, no act shall bind him with any bond. Though he slay these thousands, he is no slayer. It's interesting that this beautiful Bhagavad Gita took place on a battlefield. And there have been aspirants who have come into Vedanta because of spiritual experiences that took place on the battlefield. Yeah, when our back is to the wall, that is when we call on God most urgently. So here we're reminded of another extreme example and how Sri Krishna drives his point home. In the second chapter, verses 19 and 20, he tells Arjuna the same truth. Some say this Atman is slain, and others call it the slayer. They know nothing. How can it slay, or who shall slay it? Know this Atman, unborn, undying, never ceasing, never beginning, deathless, birthless, unchanging forever. How can it die? The death of the body. So just as water in a mirage can never wet a grain of desert sand, so also this illusory body-mind complex and Atman are completely different from each other. Attributes of the mirage can never affect the sand. Likewise, whatever transpires in the body can never affect the spirit. And that is why there is no permanent damnation for any soul. All men are born for perfection. It may take many lives, it may take much suffering, but there is no eternal damnation. Swami Prabhupada explains a simple truth these verses point to. To be free from the sense of ego, doership, means to unite with the self, the higher self. Thus, free from the effects of all our actions, we transcend the relative world of the pairs of opposites, including good and evil. From this ultimate standpoint, for the illumined soul, there exists neither slayer nor slain, nor is one bound by action. Now, Hanuman learned this from Lord Rama. He wondered how could it be that these two armies were facing each other. And Rama told him to climb on his back. And as he climbed on his back, he saw that, in fact, this war between the two armies was Rama slaying Rama. Hard to fathom for those who are not illumined. It is a matter of experience. Sri Ramakrishna warned, however, that if one has not practiced discrimination and fully understood the distinction between our psychophysical being and the Atman, The feeling, as Sri Ramakrishna said, I am he, is not wholesome. A man who entertains such an idea while looking on his body as the self causes himself great harm. He cannot go forward in spiritual life. He drags himself down. He deceives himself as well as others. He cannot understand his own state of mind. So that is why a strong ethical life is a prerequisite for spiritual realization. That is why these tapasyas we read about in Raja Yoga, they strengthen the mind. They make the mind subtle. They make the mind an instrument of the divine. Sri Ramakrishna firmly instructs, if a man has the firm conviction that God alone is the doer and he is his instrument, then he cannot do anything sinful. He who has learned to dance correctly never makes a false step. One cannot even believe in the existence of God until one's heart becomes pure. So, in other words, we must begin where we are, and with the help of a qualified teacher, proceed systematically to climb to the heights of union with Brahman. Proceed with our spiritual practice every day without fail. Verses 18 through 22, Sri Krishna says, there are three things which motivate action: knowledge, the knower, and that which is known. There are three constituents of action: the instrument, the purpose, and the doer. Sankhya philosophy declares that knowledge, action, and doer are three kinds only, according to the guna which predominates in each. Listen, this is their nature. There is that knowledge from sattva proceeding which knows one being deathless in every creature, entire amidst all division. Rama slaying Rama, that vision. The knowledge that is Rajas knows nothing but difference. Many souls and many creatures, all various, each apart from his fellow. The knowledge that is Tamas knows no reason. Its sight distorted takes the part for the whole, misreading nature. So when Sri Krishna says there are three things which motivate action: knowledge, the knower, and that which is known, this verse refers to knowledge of the senses, which without the ego, the knower, no action is possible. When I awake, I want to satisfy my hunger. So I, the knower, know my hunger will be satisfied by eating, which is knowledge, breakfast, that which is known. When Krishna says knowledge, action, and doer are three kinds only, according to the guna which predominates in each, here we learn that there are three kinds of knowledge, according to the knower's temperament and level of discrimination. The highest knowledge is sought by sattvic temperaments, those spiritual aspirants who rely on discrimination. All of you who are spiritual aspirants, such aspirants strive to see Brahman everywhere and in all beings. For those of you who follow the path of devotion, you strive to superimpose your chosen ideal in the hearts of all beings that you meet and interact with, your family members, your friends, even your enemies. But that does not mean that you embrace the tiger god. You salute the tiger god from a distance. Swami Pravrajika described the experience. And when they are illumined, this world of multiplicity disappears for them in the realization of oneness. After returning to normal consciousness, they see this world of multiplicity, but also the unity in the diversity, the one in the many, That is sattvic knowledge. And one of the most beautiful examples of this is Christ on the cross and his saying, his immortal saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. You see, Swami Pravrajika used to tell us, Jesus did not suffer at all. He was an avatar. He could detach from the body. And this statement shows that he saw the Atman within all, the one consciousness in all, covered over by ignorance. Sri Ramakrishna said, Sattva alone shows the way to God. It produces virtues like compassion, righteousness, and devotion. Again, Sattva is like the last step of the stairs. Next to it is the roof. The supreme Brahman is man's own abode. But it's important to note that Sri Ramakrishna said, one cannot attain the knowledge of Brahman unless one transcends the three gunas. How can we try to attain this knowledge? Our teachers tell us to use the experience of the seers as a means to an end. Strive to see God everywhere, the one universal self in all. Then our spiritual practice effects a tremendous transformation within us. Our mind and behavior change, and we develop love and compassion for all. People who are dominated by rajas see themselves as separate from others and attach importance to race, caste, and nationality. Those individuals in whom tamas predominates enjoy a mere physical existence and never even consider that there is a God that transcends a physical form. Now we come to verses 23 and 25, the end of this talk. Sri Krishna says, the act of sacred duty done without attachment, not as pleasure desired, not as hated compulsion, by him who has no care for the fruit of his action, that act is of sattva. The act of weary toil done in spite of nature, under the whip of lust and the will of the ego, that act is of rajas. The act undertaken in the hour of delusion, without count of cost, squandering strength and treasure, heedless of harm to another, by him who does not question his power to perform it, that act is of tamas. So these verses explain how the three gunas manifest in the various ways we work. The act of sacred duty, motiveless action, means action performed free from attachment without desiring the fruit of action. However, when we as aspirants perform an action as worship of God in order to realize God, that is sattvic action. So also desire to lead an ethical life or to serve others are sattvic actions. The act of weary toil that Sri Krishna refers to is to perform one's livelihood in order to make money, or to make money by dishonest means in order to lead a life of pleasure. That is rajasic action. Now, one should never give up their job because one wants to be of sattvic action. No, if your dharma is to lead a lay devotee's life, you must have a job. Our swamis often used to tell devotees who were filled with renunciation, get a job. do your dharma. Yes, and at the same time, practice their spiritual practices. Meditate, meditate, meditate. Or to work in order to promote oneself is Rajasic. Suppose someone praises what you do. Offer it to the Lord. Don't accept the praise. The act undertaken in the hour of delusion. What does that mean? When we perform work without first assessing its good or bad consequences. That is tamasic action. Also, when we jump into a project without first assessing our resources, the shortfall of which causes our project to fail, that also is born of tamas. So in conclusion, we find in spiritual life, knowledge of the three gunas provide us with invaluable guidelines by which we can carefully choose how to move in our life. The Vedanta lifestyle can be, to a great extent, self-taught if we carefully follow Sri Krishna's practical teachings. We can assess our minds, the quality of our mind, what kind of thoughts we're having. Oh, that's a tamasic thought. We're wishing ill on somebody. Or I want such and such. Oh, that's a rajasic thought. So we can understand our actions and our thoughts through the three gunas. We can then never take a wrong step. The mind becomes purified and our life, physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual, will flourish.